The HOA president banned visitors after 8 p.m., but her own parties went late into the night. When I discovered her hypocrisy, a world of lies collapsed, revealing a scheme that shocked the entire community. A story of courage, justice, and redemption that will change your perspective on power and community. Get ready for an emotional journey. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where you're watching this incredible transformation from. Well. So you think you know the meaning of hypocrisy? Let me tell you a story that will make your blood boil just like mine did. You know the type of person who creates absurd rules for others while doing whatever they please? Well, my dear HOA president was the perfect example of that. And I, a 67-year-old retired teacher who always avoided confrontation, ended up becoming her worst nightmare. Picture this: 8:15 p.m. on a Thursday night. My best friend, Teresa, rings my apartment doorbell. She brought a bottle of that red wine we love and some homemade cookies only she knows how to make. A perfect evening for two ladies just wanting to catch up. But before I could even say come in, I hear that voice that already gave me chills. Visitors after 8 p.m. are strictly prohibited by the Condo Association rules. It was Margaret, the HOA president, with that ridiculous clipboard that seemed like an extension of her arm. Who the heck did she think she was? An EPA agent? A CIA agent? I had just moved into the Sunflower Apartments after a devastating divorce that ended 40 years of marriage. 40 years, people. And all I wanted was a little peace and companionship. But no, the guardian of good conduct had to show up and ruin everything. Sorry, I didn't know about that rule, I mumbled, watching my friend's eyes widen in embarrassment. She said a quick goodbye, and I was left standing there with a bitter taste in my mouth that wasn't from the wine I couldn't drink. As I closed the door, I saw the HOA president jotting down another infraction on her precious clipboard. It was the third one that month. The other two? Oh, those were unforgivable. My son bringing my medication at 8:05 p.m. and letting my 8-year-old granddaughter run in the hallway when she visited on a Sunday afternoon. Heinous crimes, right? You must be thinking, why not complain? Why not stand up for yourself? Well, after my unexpected divorce, my self-confidence was about the same level as my savings, practically non-existent. When your husband of 4 decades decides he'd rather live with his Pilates instructor, 20 years younger, you start to doubt everything, including your ability to confront an HOA president with a dictator complex. For 35 years, I taught piano to children. I was always patient, organized, detail-oriented. My students adored me, but none of them ever saw me lose my composure. Miss Helen never raises her voice, they used to say. If they saw me now planning a revolution against the HOA president of my building, they probably wouldn't believe it. It was the third week after the incident with Teresa that hypocrisy showed its ugly face. It was 11 p.m. on a Thursday, and I was in bed trying to sleep, reading a cheesy romance novel to ward off the insomnia that had plagued me since the divorce. That's when I heard it. Music, laughter, voices, all coming from the apartment upstairs, exactly where Her Majesty HOA President Margaret lived. Wait a minute, was I having auditory hallucinations? The same woman who banned visitors after 8 p.m. was throwing a party late into the night? Hallucination, my foot. The music was so loud I could clearly make out Don't Stop Believin' by Journey. And from the sound of heels on the floor, people were dancing up there. A lot of people. I was furious, of course, but also confused. Why wasn't anyone complaining? Why didn't anyone knock on her door demanding quiet? The next day, still puzzled, I knocked on the door of my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, a 78-year-old retired baker who had lived in the building longer than anyone else. Ah, my dear, this is nothing new, she whispered, pulling me into her apartment as if we were in a secret operation. Every Thursday it's the same thing, but nobody has the guts to confront her. She's already driven out 3 residents with absurd fines until they gave up and sold their apartments. My jaw almost hit the floor. How do you mean, driven out? Mrs. Peterson offered me some coffee, the strong kind that makes your teeth tingle, and told me everything. In the last 2 years, since Margaret took over as HOA president, the Sunflower Apartments had turned into a totalitarian regime, worthy of a history book. Arbitrary rules, exorbitant fines, personal vendettas, and anyone who dared to protest got even more fines until they gave up and left. But why? What's her interest in all this? I asked, swallowing the coffee that felt more like rocket fuel. Nobody knows. For sure, replied Mrs. Peterson. But there are rumors about a man who shows up at her parties, a local politician interested in the land next to the condo building. And it was right there, in that moment, drinking strong coffee with the lady, who made the best brownies in the neighborhood, that my blood really started to boil. I might have been fragile from the divorce. I might have been insecure. I might have spent my life avoiding confrontations. But one thing I learned in 4 decades of marriage is how to recognize when someone is scheming. And my radar for trouble was going off like a fire alarm. I decided to investigate. And wow, who knew that at 67 I'd become an amateur detective? I started writing everything down in a little notebook. Yes, a real spiral notebook, because this old dinosaur still prefers pen and paper to a smartphone. Party dates, times, noise levels, approximate number of people based on the voices. On Thursdays, I started discreetly watching her apartment door. Delivery flyers started becoming part of my evidence collection. Pizza for 15 people, sushi for a group, 2 bottles of imported whiskey. Meanwhile, Mr. Henderson, an 82-year-old man with mobility issues, got fined because his son arrived at 8:10 p.m. to help him with his medication. The hypocrisy was so blatant, it almost deafened me. At the Thursday coffee gathering, a local tradition where the neighborhood ladies met for gossip and cookies, I started probing the other residents of the building. Most lowered their voices when the topic turned to the HOA president. "She has eyes and ears everywhere," said Mrs. Davis, a 74-year-old widow who lived on the first floor. "Even the janitor reports to her about who gets visitors after hours." I also learned that the traditional monthly potluck BBQ, a community event that had been happening for over 15 years, had been cancelled by the HOA president, citing excessive noise. The BBQ happened on Saturdays at 4 p.m. What excessive noise could that be? The sound of people chewing? 2 weeks later, during another of the HOA president's parties, I decided to be bolder. I went up to her floor using the excuse of borrowing sugar, the oldest trick in the book, I know, but it still works. When she opened the door, I almost choked at the scene. It wasn't just a social gathering, it was a business presentation, in full swing. There was Margaret wearing a dress that surely cost more than my monthly retirement check. The councilman, Mrs. Peterson, had mentioned, a man with strategically dyed grey hair and a Rolex shining brighter than a Christmas tree, and 3 other men in suits, all poring over what looked like blueprints and condo documents. When she saw me, Margaret almost dropped her wine glass. In seconds, her expression shifted from surprise to the fakest smile I've ever seen. "Helen, what a pleasant surprise. Come in, join us. We're just having a small gathering of friends." Friends? This looked more like a meeting of the local mob planning a heist. But I went in, of course. Curiosity got the better of common sense. And while she looked for the sugar I didn't even need, I discreetly left my phone recording in my purse. Yes, this grey-haired lady learned to use technology to her advantage. During the 20 minutes I spent there, served appetizers that were definitely not on any delivery menu. I caught snippets of conversation about increasing land value, advantageous expropriation, and convincing the resistant residents. The councilman, who introduced himself as Dr. Richard Miller, doctor of what God only knows, talked about facilitating the approval of a project at City Hall that would benefit everyone involved. When I left, with a cup of sugar and much more valuable information, my head was spinning. It was clear there was a scheme underway, but what exactly? And how could I prove it? The answer started to emerge the following month when I noticed a pattern to the parties. They always happened after city council meetings where the project, which I now knew was the construction of a shopping mall, was discussed. Through the city's website, I discovered that the land next to our condo complex was essential for the development. And who was one of the main investors? Guess who? Dr. Richard Miller, the councilman with the gleaming Rolex. The picture was forming in my head like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. Margaret was deliberately making the residents' lives hell so they would sell their apartments cheaply, devaluing the complex to facilitate a future sale of the common land. It was a plan as dirty as it was efficient. But I still lacked concrete proof. My notebook and audio recordings wouldn't be enough to convince the other residents, let alone for legal action. That's when fate, or karma, for the more spiritually inclined, decided to lend me a hand. On a rainy Thursday, during one of the HOA president's parties, there was a blackout in the entire neighborhood. The building's generator, which should have kicked in automatically, didn't start. Why? Because the HOA president had cut the maintenance service to save on condo expenses. In complete darkness while trying to light candles for her illustrious guests, Margaret tripped and fell, twisting her ankle spectacularly. The screams were so loud they woke up even Mrs. Higgins in 501, who was partially deaf and slept with her hearing aid off. I was one of the first to reach her apartment, finding her on the floor, surrounded by panicked guests who clearly didn't want to be identified in that situation. The councilman had already vanished, leaving his briefcase behind in his haste not to be associated with the scandal. Like the Good Samaritan my mother taught me to be, although at that moment I was more of an opportunistic detective, I offered to accompany her to the hospital. During the taxi ride and the wait in the emergency room, Margaret, under the influence of pain medication, became surprisingly talkative. Between groans and complaints about the doctor's incompetence, she revealed much more than she should have. "That idiot Richard promised I'd get 10% of the development," she muttered, her eyes half closed. 10% of a $200 million mall. Do you have any idea how much that is? More than I'd make in 20 years as HOA president of this building full of complaining old folks. I kept feeding her conversation, asking seemingly innocent questions, while recording everything on my phone. She told me how she had altered the Condo Association rules without approval at a meeting, how she bribed the janitor to report infractions selectively, and how she planned to use a falsified technical report to declare the building needed expensive renovations, forcing more residents to sell. When we returned to the Sunflower Apartments, Margaret with her ankle in a cast and me with explosive evidence, I knew the time to act had come. But there was still the problem of my aversion to confrontation. How could I, a retired piano teacher who had spent her life teaching children Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on the keyboard, confront a woman who didn't hesitate to manipulate people and rules to get what she wanted? The answer came in the form of Mrs. Peterson and her strong coffee. "Helen," she said when I told her everything I'd discovered, "there are times in life when we have to decide whether we'll be characters in our own story or mere spectators. You may be 67, but it's not too late to discover your courage." And, you know what, she was right. I lost my marriage, my financial security, part of my self-esteem, but I wouldn't lose my dignity, nor would I allow that woman to continue harming people like Mr. Henderson, who could barely walk, let alone move to another apartment. In the following days, while Margaret recovered at home, I started discreetly, visiting every resident in the building. From 101 to 604, I knocked on every door, often bringing a homemade cake as an excuse for the visit. I shared my findings, played the recordings, explained the scheme. Some were initially suspicious. After all, I was the newbie in the building. But when I presented the recording of the HOA president, drugged on painkillers, confessing her plans, even the biggest skeptics were dumbfounded. "But what can we do?" many asked with that defeated tone people adopt when they've felt powerless for too long. "She has connections. She has the janitor on her side. She knows influential people." I would smile and reply, "We have something much more powerful, the truth and numbers. We are 48 apartments against one corrupt HOA president." In parallel, with my diplomatic visits, I made two crucial discoveries. First, in the communal laundry room, yes, that place nobody wants to spend more time in than necessary, I found documents the HOA president had forgotten before her accident. Among them, a copy of the original Condo Association bylaws proving the unauthorized changes and, get this, a preliminary contract between her and one of the councilman's companies detailing her commission for facilitating the land sale. The second discovery came via the janitor, Mr. Jones. Contrary to expectations, after a long chat over coffee and donuts, never underestimate the power of simple comfort food in negotiations, he confessed he was being blackmailed by the HOA president. Margaret threatened to fire him, alleging theft of cleaning supplies if he didn't cooperate by selectively reporting infractions. At 63, supporting a wife with health problems, Mr. Jones saw no other option. "But now, Miss Helen," he told me, wiping away furtive tears, "I'm tired of being complicit in this. My mother taught me the value of honesty, and this isn't the example I want to set for my grandchildren." Armed with documents, recordings, testimonies, and the determination only a wronged 67-year-old woman can possess, I called an emergency meeting. Since the bylaws allowed any resident to do so with signatures from at least 1/3 of the homeowners, it wasn't hard to get the necessary support. I scheduled it for a Thursday at 7 p.m., so the HOA president couldn't use the no visitors after 8 p.m. excuse to prevent attendance. On the day of the meeting, the Sunflower Apartments party room, the same one that had been closed off for the monthly potluck BBQ, was packed. Residents who barely knew each other chatted excitedly, united by the possibility of freedom from that tyrannical regime. Margaret arrived limping, her ankle still bandaged, with a disdainful look that turned to concern when she saw how many people were there. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, visibly disturbed. "An emergency meeting called by whom? What's the agenda?" "By me," I replied, standing up. My voice trembled a bit at first, but soon found its firmness. "And the agenda is your immediate removal from the position of HOA president for manipulating rules, abusing power, and illegally negotiating the community's common property." The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Margaret laughed nervously. "This is absurd. You have no proof, and even if you did, you'd need a 2/3 vote to remove me." That's when I began presenting the evidence one by one, methodically, like someone teaching musical scales. I played the recordings, showed the documents I'd found, the preliminary contract with the councilman's company. Mr. Jones, trembling, like a leaf but determined, gave his testimony about the instructions to selectively report infractions. With each new revelation, the HOA president's face lost a little more color. When I played the recording of her in the hospital, confessing her plans under the influence of medication, a collective murmur of outrage swept through the room. At that critical moment, the party room door opened, and who should walk in? None other than Councilman Richard Miller, with his gleaming Rolex and a smile as fake as a $3 bill. "Good evening, everyone," he said, as if at a campaign rally. "I heard about the meeting and came personally to clear up any misunderstandings. As the elected representative for this area, I'm always available to defend the residents' interests." "Oh, buddy, you picked the wrong day to play the honest politician." Before he could continue his rehearsed speech, Mr. Jones stood up and, to everyone's surprise, pulled a yellowed envelope from his pocket. "Mr. Miller," he said, with a firmness no one expected from the usually quiet janitor, "do you remember me? I worked security at your office for 2 years before coming to the Sunflower Apartments, and I took some souvenirs with me." The envelope contained documents proving the connection between the councilman and several construction companies, including the one interested in the land adjacent to the condo complex. There were also copies of bank deposits made to the HOA president disguised as consulting fees. It was the final blow. Margaret tried to stand up, perhaps to flee, perhaps to attack someone. We'll never know. But her ankle didn't cooperate. She collapsed back into her chair, defeated, while the councilman, realizing he was in hostile territory, mumbled something about another urgent commitment and vanished from the room faster than rubbing alcohol on a hot day. The vote to remove. Margaret was nearly unanimous, 46 in favor, 1 against her own, and 1 abstention from Mr. Gable in 402, who had slept through the entire meeting and only woke up for the coffee. When we announced the result, an explosion of applause shook the room. People who barely spoke to each other were hugging, some crying with relief. It was as if a dark cloud had finally been blown away from the Sunflower Apartments. But the surprise of the night was just beginning. When it came time to elect an interim president until the next regular meeting, Mrs. Peterson stood up and with a sly smile said, "I nominate Miss Helen from 303. All in favor?" My jaw must have hit the center of the earth. Me? HOA president? The woman who avoided confrontation? Who couldn't even complain when her pizza was delivered with the wrong toppings? But I don't even know where to start," I stammered, watching hands go up all over the room. Mrs. Peterson smiled with that wisdom only years can bring. Nobody is born knowing, my dear, and you've shown more courage and integrity in 4 months here than many people show in a lifetime. And so, with a vote even more overwhelming than Margaret's removal, even Mr. Gable, now wide awake, voted enthusiastically, I became the new HOA president of the Sunflower Apartments. Me, Helen Campbell, 67 years old, retired piano teacher, newly divorced and now, surprisingly, community leader. In the months that followed, we worked hard to undo the damage caused by Margaret. We reviewed the bylaws collectively, abolishing absurd rules like the 8 p.m. visitor curfew. We reintroduced community celebrations, starting with a potluck BBQ that went down in the complex's history, not just for the food, which was divine thanks to Mrs. Peterson's recipes, but for the energy of renewal in the air. The adjacent lot, which had been the target of the councilman and his cronies, was transformed into a small park with a community garden. The project even got featured in the local newspaper, attracting residents from other buildings to see our initiative. Thursdays, once feared for the noise from the HOA president's clandestine parties, became days for open meetings in the party room, where we discussed improvements and shared experiences. As for Margaret, well, she sold her apartment 2 months after being removed and moved to another neighborhood. We heard that Councilman Richard Miller faced an investigation at City Hall for conflict of interest and ended up not being re-elected in the next election. As my grandmother used to say, time tells all, and justice, though slow, eventually prevails. For me, the journey was about much more than exposing a corrupt HOA president. It was about rediscovering my own voice after years of marriage, where I was gradually silenced without even realizing it. It was about understanding that avoiding confrontation isn't always a sign of peace. Sometimes it's just fear disguised as virtue. Today, at 68, I look at my life and smile at the unexpected. The divorce I thought was the end of everything turned out to be just the beginning of a new chapter. Visitors after 8 p.m. are not only allowed at the Sunflower Apartments, they're encouraged, especially for the older residents, who often have family members who can only visit after work. On Thursday nights, when we gather in the party room for our community coffee and weekly discussion, I look around and see smiling faces, people who have regained pride in their home. And I think to myself, who knew that revenge against a tyrannical HOA president would not only be sweet, but also the beginning of a true community? As I often say in our meetings now, sometimes we need to face the darkness to rediscover our own light. And the light of the Sunflower Apartments, my friends, has never shone brighter than it does now, illuminating far beyond 8 p.m. And you, have you ever faced an injustice that seemed too big to fight? Believe me, it's never too late to discover your own strength. I found mine at 67, and it was just the beginning of a revolution that transformed not just a building, but an entire community. Because in the end, an older lady with a notebook, determination, and the truth on her side can be more powerful than any authoritarian HOA president with a clipboard. Oh, and the next time someone tries to impose absurd rules on you while breaking those same rules themselves, remember the story of HOA President Margaret and Miss Helen. Some revolutions don't start with grand armies, but with a gray-haired lady who simply decided she was tired of staying silent. And you, are you tired of staying silent?